Okay, hi everybody. My name's Frances Knight and I'm presenting a new tool. I know people get a bit sick of new tools, so I'm hoping you'll still have some interest for this one. And this is a tool that Elaine Ferguson and I have developed with an Amana grant. And it's a tool for using multiple criteria decision analysis, which you don't have to understand right now. We're going to explain what it means, to really look at the trade-offs when you're making selections of foods to promote in nutrition-sensitive agriculture projects. So as a starting point, I'm not saying that this is relevant to all nutrition-sensitive agriculture projects, but for many, at some point, they're involved with promoting a particular combination of foods or individual foods for production or consumption or both. So that's where we're starting from. And the new tool that we've developed is really about supporting the decision-making about which combinations of these foods you might want to promote for production or consumption or both. Now, what decisions exactly am I speaking about here? There's a few different ones that we've identified, and it really depends a little bit on the decision makers. It could be, from a nutrition standpoint, foods to promote for consumption, so the traditional food-based recommendations that they'd like to include with an agricultural program or have standalone, or it could be food-based recommendations to complement an existing agriculture program. So if there's a big dairy project or a big orange flesh sweet potato project, they might want to pick some foods that would complement those main foods that are promoted. This also might be relevant to agricultural programmers, but they might also want some decisions about which particular foods to promote for production. So that could be in a standalone homestead food model where you're talking about a selection of vegetables and chickens or maybe small fish or small ruminants to produce. Or it could be, once again, selecting a combination of foods that they might want to produce alongside a main crop that's being the target of a bigger program. Or it could also be selecting particular varieties that they might want to promote. And smallholders also come into this. I need to put here at this stage, this tool is really looking at smallholder agriculture. There could be discussions about what sort of foods might we want to grow in our particular area or in our communal gardens. So these decisions are not simple because there's often more than one criteria that come into play when people are making these decisions. This is just one example of a combination of foods and how they might score across different criteria. However, as a nutritionist, I might say, well, that's not acceptable. I want to increase how this combination scores across nutrition, and that's going to have a flow-on effect for the other scores there. Okay, in a similar way, if I was an agricultural programmer, it might also be important to me, it might be more important actually, that there is only a combination of foods that can handle the local water restrictions. So I might then say, here we go, perfect timing. Well, I'm going to prioritise the most the criteria that is water requirements. And when I do that, it will have an effect on the other criteria that I might have in my decision, and I might come out with a completely different, maybe I'm putting that there. I might come out with a completely different combination of foods there. So these criteria are really important, and really not just looking at the criteria, but looking at the trade-offs that happen here are important. We didn't just come up with this tool overnight. I wish we were that smart, but instead we did about a year's worth of literature review and qualitative research with many people working in this field. I'm going to boil all of those findings down to one slide. First of all, we identified that, the research was really looking at who the decision makers are, what sort of decisions are made about what foods to promote, or what criteria is important when making those decisions, and also how those decisions are currently made. So we really worked out that the main decision makers are nutrition programmers and agriculture programmers, but smallholders are also often decision makers themselves. There's a lot of participatory processes that are valued here. Now, there are a lot of criteria that are really relevant for these sorts of decisions. However, many of these criteria are different, and many different stakeholders weight them very differently. So for the ag programmers, things like yield, income, they're never going to stop being important if they're traditional ag programs. You're not just going to suddenly make it nutrition sensitive and forget all of the other criteria. The same for smallholders. If something is not locally acceptable, if something is not going to be interesting to them from a market standpoint, they're probably not going to want to grow it. So there are many criteria, there's a lot of crossover with the criteria, but the way they're weighted or how important they are to people is quite different. That was not the only groups that were coming in as important here. Government priorities and donor priorities were often seen as something that made the decision for a project from the outgo. So if a particular government had maize as a priority crop, possibly coming in with something new was just not an option. So that's also to be considered. There were some really good guides that exist for some nutrition-sensitive agriculture programs, homestead food production being the main one, where they list out many really important criteria that should be considered during this sort of decision-making. However, none of these guides consider trade-offs. So with some of them, there are up to 60 criteria that somebody should choose just for selecting vegetables to promote in a homestead food production program. That's fantastic, but it's not as practical when you need to really look at, what is most important. There are not as many systematic processes used as you would like. I mean, one systematic process I've told a few people about this week was pressing sort on an Excel table that had the vitamin A content of all of the foods and choosing the top 5. So there is a little bit of room for improvement there. I'm not saying that that is everybody at all. And most people we spoke to said that they would be interested in using a tool as long as it was fast, as long as it didn't have very high data requirements, and as long as it was simple to use. And they really wanted it if it could encourage transparency in this decision making. So it wasn't something that was made at HQ or at the national office and then applied to local people. It was something that needed to be transparent so people could see where the decisions were made and why, but also participatory. We identified many, many different criteria that we could include in the tool. And what we boiled it down to was a list of 25 that are prepared at the moment to go in the tool, but this list is flexible. This is not the full list of criteria. This is sort of general umbrella areas that they sit under. So at the moment, for 25 criteria that fit under these umbrellas, we have, developed the algorithms with which we could include them in the tool, and we've worked out different inputs and how they would be treated in the mathematical model, depending on whether you had good quantitative data to go into the model, or if you didn't and wanted to use a qualitative estimates based on expert opinion. So there's also that option if you don't have time or don't have the data available. The ones in yellow are really the ones that we'd like a little bit more support and consultation on, and we're still finalising that process. And you can pick up to 10 to go into the analysis itself, and that selection really depends on the project and the context. So how MCDA works? It is a simple method for complex decisions, and I think we've probably got enough evidence now to say this is a complex decision that needs a simple method. It compares options across conflicting criteria. So when I'm talking about options here, it's different combinations of foods to promote for production or consumption. It really takes into account how stakeholders might value those different criteria, and it provides a ranked list of options. That's not all it does, however. It then lets people look at how those weights or other inputs would change that list of options. So you can then look at the results if you just took the nutrition programmers' weightings into account, if you just took the agriculture programmers' weightings, if you just took women's smallholders into account, for example, it would allow you to look at a comparison and use that to help with your decision making. And it would also allow you then to identify trade-offs. If you have one particular combination that is scoring very high across nutritional input and possibly water use, but is scoring very low on local acceptability, that might be something that you say, well, that's non-negotiable for my project, or it might be something that you say, well, I have to do something to try and improve that when I'm rolling out my program. Into how the model actually works, and this is a very simple version. You start by determining your decision context and identifying who your stakeholders are that are going to really put inputs into your model. And then you work out what your decision objectives are and define those criteria. You work with your stakeholders to weight the criteria in different stakeholder groups. And then you identify what sort of options you might want to compare. Now, you don't have to identify every possible combination of foods. You put in the individual foods, and the tool will then create all of those different options for you. This is just a couple of examples. And we model them on the basis of a whole diet. So we put in staple foods and other things in there, so it's a whole diet. You then put in your individual scores against each food for every criteria. As I said, qualitative or quantitative options depending on your data inputs. And then the software will multiply the option scores by the weights to get a final ranking. You can then play with those different inputs to see what the difference would be if you had other person's weightings, or if you weren't too sure about the initial scores that you put in and want to test how they would be different. You keep repeating these steps until you have enough evidence to inform your decision making. This is just an example of what the software looks like. You get your final weighted list. And then you can dive into that a little bit more to be able to look at what the trade-offs are for everyone. You can also export that data to sort of look a little bit more across the information. For example, here you might see, okay, well, if that particular criteria, women's income potential, is getting an orange line there, it might mean that we have to do something better there to improve it. We apply this in a participatory way, I know. We would never expect people to just go alone and do an analysis and then come out with an answer. You would identify your decision objectives and your stakeholders, and then possibly have small workshops with different stakeholder groups to get your weighting and do the analysis with them. It would be really good if you could then bring everybody together, share the results with them, and also get them to look at maybe if they could come up with a group weighting and then apply that and have a discussion about the results. Often in the literature with multi-criteria decision analysis, it has been shown that sometimes the results with different weightings are more similar than you would think. So it's often a way to build consensus and get people to see something through somebody else's eyes. And that really contributes to the decision process. Important points to remember: this is not a decision-making tool, it's decision support. It's really concerned with selecting foods to promote for production or consumption, and you really want to use it when there's multiple criteria, when you have some of these are conflicting, and when you've got a lot of stakeholders and you want to work across these stakeholders in a participatory and transparent way. We're currently finalising the software. We've got a beta version that we're testing. We'll be piloting it throughout the rest of the year, and then this software will definitely be open access and free with resources for everybody to use, and we hope to present it in a more formal way next year. There's a handout outside, or I've got copies if you're interested, and we would love to hear people's input. And lastly, I'd really like to acknowledge the amount of funding and the software company we've partnered with for doing this, and Elaine, of course. Thank you very much.